Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here this evening to welcome you to this winter alumni lecture with the Faculty of Life Sciences. Thank you for coming. It's wonderful to be here as the relatively new dean. I arrived earlier this year, and to see the amazing research, scholarship and teaching going on across the faculty. Cellular biology, molecular sciences, right through to neuroscience, to ecosystems, biodiversity we're going to hear about this evening, and also drug discovery and pharmaceuticals. It's an amazingly diverse faculty full of talented and students. And this evening we're going to be addressing a particularly concerning issue, and that of biodiversity. So Professor John Bridle is going to give our lecture this evening. John joined us in 2020 as a professor of evolutionary biology. In 2022, he was appointed to be director of the Centre for Environmental Research, CBER. Before that, he's had a very long career, starting at University of Manchester, where he studied environmental sciences, a PhD at Leeds, followed by postdocs, where we nabbed him at UCL, and he did a period at the zoo, and then he was appointed at the University of Bristol before he returned to UCL in 2020. And John's interest really isn't about adaptation to the environment and the basis of that. And he's been absolutely committed in recent years to flying the flag for biodiversity and trying to understand the science behind declining biodiversity and how we might be able to bend the curve on that very important facet of global climate change. I'm not going to steal his thunder. I'm not going to say very much more about biodiversity, except to say I'm delighted to welcome John to give this alumni lecture, A Future We Can Get To Safely, Why and How Biodiversity Matters. John, over to you.
Thanks very much, everyone, and thanks very much for coming. It's great to be asked to give this lecture. I've got the great privilege of being Director of the Centre for Biodiversity Environment Research, which is part of the Department of Genetics, Evolution and Environment at UCL. And it's fantastic to be part of a department where people, as Gail says, are studying biodiversity at all these different levels of organisation, from what goes on within cells, different genomes interacting within cells, to what goes on between organisms living within organisms, so microbiomes, what goes on between cells within organisms in different organ systems, as well as what goes on between individuals in populations of different species, like in these kinds of ecological communities that we maybe don't celebrate nearly as much as we ought to. I've put up this coral reef picture here because you are going to have the opportunity when we go to the Grant Museum later to actually interact with corals through virtual reality, which I hope won't be the only way that we'll be able to interact with coral reefs in the future. I've rather optimistically called this lecture A Future We Can Get To Safely, and I'm going to try and explain how that's something that still remains something of a challenge given the current climate. I'm going to start off, there's going to be 4 parts to what we're going to discuss tonight. I'll start off asking why does biodiversity and its ecosystems matter in part 1, then I'll talk about what's happening to biodiversity, what we know, which is actually a huge amount of scientific effort has gone into understanding what's actually happening to biodiversity, how fast it's declining, and whether those declines are different to what's happened in the past in their structure, in the way that things are changing. I'm going to ask the kind of how of biodiversity. So this is very much part 3 focusing on what we do at UCL, which is asking how does biodiversity itself contribute to ecological resilience, the ability of communities and populations to respond to environmental change and remain where they are or move somewhere where they can better survive. So we're going to be asking how, we'll be touching on some of the research that we're doing in our group there. And then the last part, hopefully we'll get to it, is finding a future that we can get to safely. So how can we best tackle these enormous challenges that are being thrown at us by the way that we're using this environment that we're in, this planet that we live on, that we all live on, and we all share, and the way that we're perhaps dislocated from the biodiversity that we share, that we're part of on this planet. So the first part, so why does biodiversity and its ecosystems matter? Well, I'm going to start off thinking about coral reefs and thinking about the experience of going diving on a coral reef, hands up if you've ever been on a coral reef and dived on a coral reef, it really is an astonishing experience. And I've never seen such faces of unbridled joy as you get when you come up from the water, you resurface, and suddenly everyone is on the boat and everyone is excitedly talking about what they've seen. This kind of connection is really a great metaphor for what we all need to do in terms of the way we connect with ecosystems and communities. It's like you go under the surface of the water, it seems like it's just the surface of the sea, and you go under there and you see these incredible things interacting with each other. And this sort of sense of joy as you emerge is really, really palpable. I feel very privileged as a biologist, the fact that I'm a biologist, that I can also think about the communities that are existing way beyond these coral reefs that always existed that maybe people weren't aware of. So these guys on the boat, inside their stomachs, inside their intestines, there are thousands and thousands of species of bacteria which are contributing to the digestion of their food. There's organisms, there are multitudes within them. They are themselves ecosystems. They actually contain as many cells that are not human as are human, which is quite a mind-blowing bit of information. But there's biodiversity everywhere. There's biodiversity, obviously, within their cells themselves, the different genomes that interact within those cells. That's also biodiversity. There's biodiversity at all these different levels. And of course, there's biodiversity when you look at the trees that are behind them there. I think I'm even more privileged as a biologist because I can grab the side of the boat, and I remember doing this, grabbing the side of the boat and thinking, that wood itself is part of an ancient ecosystem. That wood once had water flowing through it. Once had it was responding to pathogens and fungi and birds and insects that were feeding on it and interacting with it and pollinating it in the places in the forest where this wood originally came from. There's biodiversity everywhere, both from the past and from the present in the immediate, in the existing moment. The other thing that's particular about being a biologist is that one of the penalties in ecological education is one lives alone in a world of wounds. So one is painfully aware of the fact that this biodiversity is fast disappearing. And I started, the last few times I went diving, started kind of having this kind of ritual. I would kind of apologize to the reef before I resurfaced, and I would kind of feel like I might never see that reef again. And that's something that people who study coral reefs talk about all the time. And actually the dive instructor on this particular boat, remember he said to me, I wish I could bring all the politicians around the world to see this reef, and that would change everything. You think, well, we don't have to go into the reef to see it. Obviously, we can't all go to the reef to see it. We have to change our own imagination and see communities and biodiversity everywhere, which is reconnecting with the nature that we're part of and that is part of everything. Now, all of us have to do this in our own way. All of us have to find a way to reconnect with our cousins, to engage with biodiversity in the way that, obviously, one of our favourite people of all of us, David Attenborough, does on his programs, this idea of connecting with biodiversity that we're all part of. And my story, in particular, was one where I never intended to be a biologist. I never really wanted to be a biologist in particular. I was very keen on fiction. And actually, I've got my father to thank for that, because my father's a very practical man. My father said to me one time, I was about 13, he said, why do you bother reading fiction? Why don't you just read non-fiction? So in response, he wanted me to read books about engines and how things worked and some physics. And so thanks to him, I ended up reading lots and lots and lots of fiction as a 13-year-old. I read fiction all the time. And that meant that it gave me this really acute sense of this joy of thinking about how other people in the past and other people of other genders or other cultures, how they see the world and how they imagine it. And that's actually something that biologists do all the time. I think it's very important that scientists read fiction because they sort of start to think about what is it that's going on in these organisms that I can barely imagine? How are they experiencing the environment? How are they dealing with it? What decisions are they making? Just the same way that dramas and tragedies are like that. And I went along for quite a long time. I was really interested in studying history, studying literature and languages at university. And then I read an essay by H.G. Wells, where he says, all history is human ecology. And I thought, why didn't I think of this before? Why didn't I realize that actually what's going on in my dramas and my tragedies and my Jane Austen novels is actually stuff that's going on all the time in the communities that we go into, that we experience every day when we go outside, or even when we're just feeling like a bit sick from what we've eaten that day. All of us are reacting to biodiversity and dealing with it in these ways all the time. So biologists study drama and politics and tragedies at a huge scale all of the time. Because what's happening in ecosystems is that genes and organisms from very, very different places, very different times, very different histories, are coming together interacting in communities, in ecosystems, making decisions about how they're going to interact. And that biodiversity is very subtle, it's very nuanced, it's very hard to measure, but it's what is keeping everything on this planet afloat. It's what's keeping everything, all our human economies working. And I think, if you look at paintings, I was also very interested, I still am very interested in paintings. Lots of artists are doing this as well. You start looking at artists like Dürer and you think about the way he painted himself as this kind of messianic figure. He was friends with Martin Luther, he was obsessed, he loved parties, he was a very sensual person. What does he do one day? He looks out of his kitchen window in Nuremberg and paints a patch of grass. So well that you can see 13 or 14 different species of grass interacting here with other types of herbs. And so what he's doing there is he's looking at biodiversity, finding it again for himself. He's turning to nature and finding otherness in it and finding the familiar in it, in the same way that biologists do, as students of nature do. So he's reconnecting, he's reclaiming, refinding his proper place in nature. My other favourite example of this is Da Vinci. If you read Da Vinci's sketchbooks, or look at them, Da Vinci hardly painted anything during his lifetime. He actually was very, very unproductive in terms of art, because every time he had to draw like a biblical scene or religious scene, he would think, I really need to get the flowers right at the bottom of Christ's. So he would plant seeds and draw them every day. And if there's ever a book that says, leave me alone, just let me look at nature, it's Da Vinci. And he realised that I just have to look at nature and then I see something in myself, or myself in it. I connect with my cousins, I find the beauty that's everywhere around us that we overlook. We re-examine the familiar through art and through science. And this is something that I think we've had to kind of relearn. We relearn it through art, but I think for indigenous peoples and for most of human history, we actually had a very close association with much of biodiversity. We thought about the value of biodiversity for us, for people. We were dependent on understanding plants and how they grew and where they grew and what medicines they might provide, what health benefits they might provide. Throughout human history, this was a really key part of our lives. If you look at ancient iconographies, lots and lots of examples of a detailed understanding of plants. The very few Mayan and Aztec manuscripts that weren't destroyed by Europeans are testament to just how well they understood biodiversity in their backyard, things they depended on for living. And the reason, again, that plants have got medicinal value is because of their interactions with other organisms, because they're defending themselves against insects, against pathogens, against fungi. That's why they're so good at treating human health. That's why they have such flavours for cooking. That's why they have such effects, such psychoactive effects on us. And it's very interesting to look at what happened around the sort of 18th, 19th century as people started to go into cities more and more. There's a real fear amongst botanists that people would lose, the poor, particularly in London, would lose their understanding of these plants, which led to these emergence of these cheap herbal guides like Culpeper's Guide, which is intended for EastEnders living around Shoreditch and Hoxton to know which of the ruderal plants they could still use, which would give them health benefits if they couldn't afford to go to the doctor. So lots and lots of examples of this disconnection from nature that happened as a result of industrialization and movement into the cities, as well as colonization. Now, of course, one of our heroes, or one of my heroes, certainly Darwin, I credit him as having been instrumental in connecting us with our cousins again. Two great conclusions, two great insights that Darwin gave us with. First of all, he demonstrated that life evolved by natural selection. He also shows us that all living things are cousins. And that probably he's not given as much credit for as he should. This idea that there is a tree-like structure to life, that all things are cousins of each other, all existing life. Now with modern sort of technology, this is actually quite an old phylogeny, we can see the absolute truth of that. We can see the domains of life as we understand them. We can see how biodiversity is distributed through time in terms of sharing a last common ancestor. And this very quickly helps us to regain our proper place in nature, which is a very tiny place in nature. I usually ask the undergraduates to put their hands up when they can spot where the animals are. This little twig here, just above the fungi, that's all the animals on the planet are there. And that tiny twig, that's us and everyone else that we think moves around the animals. All of the fungi are here, more closely related to animals than to plants, which are up here. This is all of the land plants, sandwiched between two different types of algae, which we might just call seaweed when we see them, green and red algae. And there's brown algae, are even more different, they're all the way over here somewhere. You've got all these incredible things that we spend our lives thinking about are actually a tiny, tiny twig on the tree of life. Lots and lots of stuff that we didn't actually know this diversity existed because we couldn't cultivate most of it in petri dishes. These fungi, these bacteria actually depend on very complex species interactions, which means that you have to you look at their genomes to tell you they're there. You can't grow them in laboratory conditions very easily. There are lots and lots of biodiversity that we know very little about. Lots and lots of genes and organisms with very different histories coming together to form ecological communities. If you think about our coral reefs, you've got the cynodorians, the coral-building animals here, and they're interacting with dinoflagellates, which are the algae inside them, which are making them those bright colours. And of course, they're interacting with lots of fish here as well, but also they're interacting within their cells with mitochondria and with descendants of cyanobacteria or sister species of cyanobacteria, which are the chloroplasts. So in communities, you have all these very different organisms coming together, these different histories coming together to form these communities. So really sort of interesting to see how distant they are, and also think about the fact that fungi, mushrooms, when you go to the supermarket, you should be finding them next to the meat counter, not with the vegetables. So this is only one way of thinking about biodiversity, this history of this phylogenetic tree of the tree of life. We can also think about biodiversity in terms of its hierarchical structure, these different layers of biodiversity that exist, variation among genes within species, variation among species, variation among the ecosystems that are made up of those species. Biodiversity is the variety of all living things and their interactions. And you can also see that when you think about the number of species that have been described, only about 2 million have been described so far. That's probably about a 10th or a 20th of the number of species that actually exist. The vast majority of them are invertebrates and insects and flowering plants. Very, very few amphibians and mammals. Another showing us what a tiny part of biodiversity we are. And if you think about biodiversity in another way, in terms of biomass, in terms of how much carbon is actually occupying on the planet, how much these different groups occupy, plants by far have the largest biomass, followed by bacteria and fungi, and then you go down into a tiny corner here of the animals. You see the animals are mostly split up into arthropods and fish. Humans here are our coral reefs here, our cynodarians. As we'll come back to later, see how many livestock there are. Biomass of livestock compared to the biomass of humans. What I'm trying to get across here is that biodiversity is a very complex, beautiful, nuanced thing to get across. There are lots of different ways to visualize biodiversity, and it's not easy, like with people studying climate change and studying how effective we are at removing carbon or preventing carbon going to the atmosphere. We can just measure the amount of carbon in the atmosphere at any one place. But with biodiversity, we've got all these different ways of looking at it. Very beautiful, very nuanced ways of thinking about it. And even these 3 different ways of thinking about biodiversity, they tell you nothing about how organisms actually interact in communities. All these beautiful ways that species come together to interact, or genes come together to interact in chromosomes or within cells. All of these interactions, they're only known for a very small number of communities, and a very small number of species. The other thing that's really important about biodiversity, apart from its beauty and our love of it, and the fact we need to reconnect with it, is that it's absolutely critical for our way of life. It's actually, until we learn how to photosynthesize, we are not going to be able to live on this planet without biodiversity. It's a zero-sum game. Without biodiversity, there is nothing. There's no economy at all. And a lot of that stuff is coming from the direct harvesting of natural ecosystems for wood or for proteins from the ocean, as well as the kind of more managed ecosystems we think of when we think about wheat and rice growing in fields. If there's one thing I want you to take away from what we've been talking about, it is the fact that biodiversity, everything about the social domain and the economic domain is nested within biodiversity. So this graph here, which is something that one of our most celebrated alumni or celebrated professors at University College London, Georgina Mace, who was the first director of CBER, she spent most of her career emphasizing, or much of her career emphasizing this fact that the economy is nature. And what's happening now, of course, for a long time, Kate Raworth talks about the cowboy economy. It was easy, the economic domain was quite small compared to the ecological domain. It had relatively little pressures on it. And now the economic domain is really pressing against the edge of the ecological domain, as we'll see. And that's what's causing so much of a decline, an emergency, and a loss of nature. So what I think this first part is really about is telling us that what we really need to do is mainstream biodiversity. Our conception of biodiversity before, perhaps the last 100 years or so, certainly in European communities, has much more been about thinking about individual species that are charismatic, unusual, the kind of exotic animals like pandas and kestrels that are rare. And I think now biodiversity and conservation is much more about the fundamental, the communities, the fundamental ecological processes that sustain economies and sustain climate. We're trying to protect functional biology, functional ecosystems. And that means there's increasingly a focus on how genes and species interact, how they form communities by their interactions within and between species. So we're trying to return back to this world where we were much more familiar with communities and their value to us. Thinking about, this is a biome here, so what goes on, including what goes on within organisms, not just outside organisms. The biodiversity at all these different levels. So what is happening to biodiversity as a consequence of this tiny part of biodiversity, human beings and their activities? Well, the short answer is we're causing a massive reduction in nature, a massive decline in nature. This is quite an old slide. It's one of the first issues of what's called the Living Planet Index, produced by ZSL and the Worldwide Fund for Nature. It's based on about 35,000 records of the abundance and distribution of about 5,000 vertebrate species. So birds, fish, reptiles, amphibians, and mammals. And it compares that to, and so it shows, what it shows is a big decline in some parts since 1970, a big decline in the natural capital, in the abundances of these 5,000 species. With this decline of about 60% of the combined average of all tropical biomes. But don't be fooled by and the consequence of this, so this is caused by the fact that essentially we've started to exceed, in about 1980, exceed the capacity for the outputs of the planet to actually sustain the amount of consumption that we're expecting it to do. Though, however, that line ignores any wild populations having any contribution, getting any output from natural communities. Don't be fooled by the fact the temperate one seems to have gone up. That's basically the fact that by the time we started to take records, or records are available, much of temperate biodiversity would already have been lost by industrialization. We have what's called a shifting baseline problem, I'll return to later on. This is this idea of intactness, and we can see that because this is the mean species abundance index in the year 2000 compared to what we think the natural levels were. And these dark areas are areas where the biodiversity has been greatly denuded, where the abundances of these species is much lower than it should be. We can see these black areas where species abundance is very, very low. So biodiversity has already been lost from these places. That's why you have these flat lines. And in the future, most of the biodiversity is going to be lost in places where biodiversity is still abundant. Okay, so basically having essentially a process where biodiversity is being lost in the areas which are relatively intact. That makes sense, right? That's where most declines are going to be happening. We can start to look at these different biodiversity metrics, all of which are obtained via lots and lots of data, and think about how is biodiversity being affected. And the simple answer is that all biodiversity metrics are more or less pointing in the same direction. This is the Living Planet Index, which is really about telling you about the abundances of species and their contributions to communities. We can see on average a 73% loss of natural capital here. This is the Red List Index, so it's telling you about different groups of organisms, different taxonomic groups, how they're declining or increasing in their risk of extinction over time. Some of them are sort of relatively flat, but all of them are declining, some much more than others. This is corals here, declining. And also use metrics which are about the intactness index by regions. You go through different regions, you see generally a decline in the intactness of ecosystems and their ability to have the same level of function or the same level of biodiversity they used to have. And you can also have an idea of the percentage of species that have been driven extinct, so the rate of extinctions. Now you could say, we don't know that, I mean, I've updated, these are the latest graphs. They don't look very different to the graphs from the 2000s. So the rate of decline hasn't increased. It also hasn't decreased. I suppose that's kind of good news in a way. We can't say that we're not having any effect in conservation because, it's not getting any worse. There's arguably more people on the planet, more consumption. It's not getting any worse, but it's also not getting any better. Eventually, rates of decline do go to zero once there's no biodiversity left. So rates of decline will inevitably reduce over time. The fact that they're still relatively steady, I suppose, maybe is optimistic, source of optimism. You can look at differences again, at differences between different regions. These are the latest reports here. And you can see that Europe has already lost most of its biodiversity, and that's why you're not seeing these, not seeing these big declines, a 35% decline. So there's small increases now that are caused by very small increases in biodiversity in those places will have big effects on the Living Planet Index. What you really want to look at here is what's happening in the tropics where most of the biodiversity is. So people often say, well, is this a big problem? We've had extinction events in the past. Extinction is a natural process. You'll always have someone, one of your students will always say, surely extinction is natural and everything's fine. The point here is that the current rates of extinction are way, way above what there have been at any points in history before. We think in the past, in the fossil record, for every 1,000 mammal species, less than one went extinct every 1,000 years. And now we're looking at extinction rates currently they're about 1 to 1,000 times higher, likely to go up to about 10 or 100 times higher in the future. There really is an ecological emergency going on. Huge amounts of biodiversity is being lost. What we don't know is the consequence of that biodiversity for the kind of things that I was talking about, for this function of ecosystems and their ability to keep producing output that human beings can use for economies, that can use for social justice and for development. So this really brings us on to our next question of trying to understand, well, how does biodiversity actually matter for ecological resilience? What are the consequences of its loss for the function of ecosystems and for their ability to be resilient to environmental change? And this leads us to, I think, three major questions that scientists have to answer. Firstly, we have to try and tell policymakers and economists when and where will communities collapse due to environmental change. We have to ask what types of biodiversity are important for maximising resilience. Is it what types of genetic diversity, what types of species diversity? Is it taxonomic diversity? Is it functional diversity? Is it diversity in traits that determine ecological resilience? And also we have to ask a question that fascinates me in particular, as Gail said right at the beginning, is I'm particularly interested in how quickly populations can actually evolve and shift their requirements, shift their niche in order to cope with novel conditions, the novel conditions that are being imposed on them by these huge rates of environmental change. And many of you will be very familiar with the climate crisis, the climate emergency. Even without the climate crisis, even if the climate crisis stopped tomorrow, if there was no more carbon being released and no more commitment to increase warming, the loss of biodiversity alone would qualify as an emergency. And in fact, as we'll see, most of the biodiversity that's been lost already in those living planet indices and those metrics, almost all of it is currently is due to habitat loss and overexploitation. It's not yet due to climate change. It will be. We're starting to see signatures of that in the oceans, but on terrestrial environments in particular, we're seeing a massive signature of drivers of biodiversity loss is habitat change, habitat loss, overexploitation, as we'll come back to later on. The key question we want to ask is how close are we to tipping points? How urgently the kind of actions that were rather historically suggested or guided by the Cummins-Montreal conference, the COP conference, the biodiversity conference last year, how urgently do they have to be implemented? And how quickly does political will have to follow that intention? Political actual action follow that will? We'll quickly give you a flavour of the research that we're doing in our group to think about some of these questions about how biodiversity contributes to resilience. The first thing I'll talk about briefly as I take you to Australia, where we're basically doing these large-scale experiments to ask questions about how are communities affected by heat waves. Climate change is causing big changes in heat waves, and for tropical organisms, we think that's particularly a problem. Tropical organisms typically have quite narrow ranges of thermal limits that they can cope with. We want to ask, how do heat waves affect the ability of populations, the composition of those communities, so what species are there and what species remain after heat waves, so which species are lost, and are the communities after species have been lost more resilient overall than they were before to thermal future heat waves. And secondly, we want to ask whether the organisms themselves, the species themselves, change their niches, whether they evolve in response to those heat waves. Are they able to evolve quickly enough to actually show a signature of shifting their niche because they've been exposed to these conditions? What kind of intensity of conditions is too strong for them to evolve to? What kind of intensity of conditions is about right for them to be able to evolve to quickly enough to avoid extinction? So we're really thinking about limits to evolutionary responses here, as well as the way that thermal changes and heat waves and increased variance in temperature, how that's going to affect communities. lots and lots of very, very messy fieldwork, putting flies in cages, Drosophila, and looking at their interactions with parasitoids, which I won't go into any of these results yet to show you the flavour of what we're doing. Second thing we're doing is asking similar questions in butterflies and butterfly communities in Spain in particular, as well as in the UK. We're asking, we know a lot about butterflies because butterflies have been studied, they're very attractive. We know a lot about butterflies and their interactions with other species, particularly with their host plants, as well as with other butterfly species and parasitoids. We're basically asking how much organisms like butterflies are able to spread out and not experience the environment in the same way that the climate is changing. So how much they're able to actually buffer thermal change through their activities, through their behaviour. We're also asking whether having butterflies of different types of life history, different types of ecology, whether that spreads out the point where the whole community goes extinct because of heat waves, because of climate change. So we're trying to see how much biodiversity buffers communities against these tipping points where the whole communities might go extinct. So you're asking, does functional ecological diversity spread thermal tipping points in these communities? We're sort of looking at where their tolerances are and how their tolerances vary among species, and also how much individual species can change where they live, where they feed, where they move to, in order to regulate their own temperature through their behaviour. We're also doing a lot of genomics on butterflies to try and ask questions about how much of their changes historically, changes in their distribution, and their positions in communities and their niches, how much of that has come down to their actual evolution. So we sequence thousands of butterflies from the Natural History Museum's collections from 100 years ago, as well as collections from now. We look for evidence in the genomes that they've evolved in response to climate change in the past, or changes in land use in the past. And we look to see how much that evolutionary change has allowed them to stay where they are, or to shift their ranges and move to different parts of the UK or the rest of Europe. So we're asking how much do evolutionary responses contribute to persistence over time and over space. So we need to know, is evolution necessary for population size and niche shifts, for populations to be their distributions? How much does it explain it? If evolution is important, what kind of genetic variation do we need to maintain or maximize in order to allow evolution to continue? There's this really sort of interesting question that relates back to the butterflies in Spain as well, is asking, do different species respond in the same way? Do they have the same limits to evolution or very different limits? And if they have different limits, does that mean that having many species will actually make the community as a whole more resilient? This all comes down to this fundamental question of what limits rates of evolutionary change. As I touched on earlier, we're also doing a lot of work thinking about understanding how organisms themselves actually experience the environment. Because when you start thinking about ecosystems as a biologist, you realise that they don't experience the environment passively. They have agency through the organisms that they make. So organisms don't just release their gametes at a random time. These coral reefs release their gametes and try and have sex in a coordinated way. They time when they do things to match the right time. Just as butterflies decide where they're going to lay their eggs, the mums put the eggs somewhere where they think the eggs are going to have the right microclimate. There are lots and lots of things that organisms do. Genes, in a way, make organisms in order to regulate the way that they experience environmental variation. But there's all these interesting things that organisms do to try and deal with environmental variation. So climate change per se is really more of a problem if it makes the environment less predictable. As long as organisms can predict the environment and can work and actually find places where they can still thrive, then there's the potential for them to be able to survive, to be buffered against really quite high levels of climate change. If you're really smart, like many plants, you get some dumb animal to move your plant and move your seeds around for you to exactly the right place where they need to be to germinate. If you're equally smart like a sheep, you can go and find a shadow. So think about the difference in how these organisms are experiencing the environment. You couldn't just measure the temperature of this area of Spain here. You'd have to actually think about what the organism's doing in response to the environment. And that's a really interesting aspect that determines their exposure to climate change. Understanding the exposure of organisms to climate and to the environment is a difficult thing, but it has massive potential for buffering the consequences of climate change. So the key issue of all of this scientific work that we're doing is really to understand how close are we to tipping points? How close are we to understanding when whole ecosystems are likely to collapse as a result of environmental pressures, as a result of habitat loss, or as a result of climate change, as a result of the ecological emergency or the climate emergency. So you can compare things like coral reefs, or rainforests, which are these really biodiversity-rich biomes. There'll be lots of biodiversity there, lots of ancient biodiversity there, lots of ancient communities, as well as places where lots and lots of carbon is stored. And if rainforests go past a tipping point, where we lose rainforests, where the Amazon passes its tipping point, we're going to release about a quarter of the stored carbon into the atmosphere. So it's going to massively accelerate climate change if they pass a tipping point. It's a very urgent question asking how close are we in terms of deforestation to the loss of Amazonian rainforest in particular, but rainforests across the world. We're also asking whether different types of rainforests in Africa or in South America or in Indonesia, whether that all responds in a similar way. Can you consider them to be equivalent, or are they all very different because they have very different species making them up? We can sort of ask, how close are we to these tipping points? And the current best information we have is that at about a quarter of forest loss compared to what was there before, we're starting to really risk these cascading effects that lead to a tipping point and the loss of rainforest biomes across much of the tropics. Currently, we think we're about 15 to 17% of forest loss. So we're taking a huge gamble here of not knowing how soon biodiversity is going to start taking an interest in us if we refuse to take an interest in it. That old sort of paraphrase, if you don't take an interest in politics, sooner or later politics will take an interest in you. Well, it's also true of biodiversity. If you don't take an interest in biodiversity, sooner or later biodiversity will kick you back. And this is going to be a big kickback if this happens. Coral reefs, well, I think most of us who are biologists, certainly most of the coral reef scientists I know, are willing to have come to accept that it's very unlikely that most coral reefs will not be existing within a few decades. We're thinking of about 70 to 90% of coral reefs likely to be gone at 1.5 degrees of warming on average. They're very much driven by climate change, mainly because of these very intimate biotic interactions they have with these algae, with these dinoflagellates. And that may well make their tipping point really quite predictable. So we're already thinking that maybe the virtual reality experience you have with coral reefs might be you or your grandchildren's only experience of coral reefs, or at least tropical coral reefs. If we lose rainforests, we don't just lose 25%, we don't just release 25% of the world's stored carbon, we also lose 50% of the world's species, and about a fifth of the world's freshwater is actually flowing out of the Amazon. So when Bolsonaro was elected, I thought this guy is in charge of a fifth of the world's freshwater. And that's something that we'll return to in a bit later. So yeah, this is the real big questions, these big tipping points of these big biomes, where are they going to be and how close are we to them? That's a scientific question. Whether or not there's political will to change that is another issue. But it's important to remember that these are big tipping points. There's already been lots of local tipping points that have happened, and that's why we've lost all this biodiversity in communities already. And it's a very important aspect of thinking about the biology of biodiversity loss that we actually tend to overestimate the resilience of ecosystems because we're looking at ecosystems that have already lost a lot of biodiversity. And many local tipping points have been passed already. So, it's like if, all the things that you're seeing are things that weren't lethal to those particular organisms. So like Achilles, these are the areas that he can survive. So these are the ecosystems and these are the communities that have been able to survive this amount of destruction. But if Achilles had been hit on that heel, you wouldn't see him at all. So this idea of sort of survivorship bias is very, very important when thinking about biodiversity loss in communities. We tend to overestimate their resilience if we're looking at already very damaged ecosystems, or the shifting baseline problems. All we're seeing are basically communities that have already survived quite a large amount of perturbation. It's a bit like I said already, the rate of biodiversity loss will eventually slow down because eventually there'll be no biodiversity left to lose. Just the same as if you're burgled a lot of times, eventually there's nothing left to burgle and actually you're very resilient to burglary. My student flat when I lived in Manchester, I think we were burgled several times in a few weeks. We eventually just left the door wide open and nothing else was lost. Okay, so it was the rate of loss very, very much declined. All we had were tables that were nailed to the floor. None of our equipment, no hi-fi was there or anything like that. But don't be reassured by reduced rates of loss. They could be just pointing to very high levels of damage. The key point I want to return to, though, is that we don't know much about most biodiversity. We know very, very little about. So there's a lot of hope in these tipping points. It might well be that a lot of the biodiversity that we've used to make these declines from, that tells us about these ecological emergencies, they could be based on ecosystems that are very different to the ecosystems about which we know very little, like ecosystems in the soil, ecosystems in the deep sea, ecosystems within our own bodies. And actually, we don't know, I think it's a big scientific question to ask, do these same rules for resilience apply across taxa, latitudes, and different biomes? That's a really important question, which we're starting to address in particular at UCL, because we have a whole new centre which Kate has founded, which is particularly about understanding how we can use new tools to study biodiversity that previously has been quite cryptic, biodiversity by improved monitoring tools, looking at species that we previously knew very little about, to test how different types of communities respond to biodiversity loss and environmental change, and also to ask questions about the way that they're resilient and the way that species interact in communities that are being perturbed. And also understanding the way that people and biodiversity interact. We've had a load of really amazing new appointments coming into the GEE as a result of this foundation of this amazing campus and this amazing new place at UCL East. I'm just going to quickly just go, I've got part 4, I'm going to do 5 minutes just on part 4. So I thought I might get, this is the difficult bit, which is probably the bit you've all been waiting for, and I'm just going to try and summarise what's happening here. So how do we find a future that we can safely get to? We can see what's happening to biodiversity, we can see why it matters so much. Why is biodiversity loss still happening? Well, the main aspect is that economic benefits are huge, but they're felt over very long distances and timescales. There's a huge problem of subsidies, mostly public subsidies, distort markets, make environmental destruction profitable, at least for some people. And we are seeing a weakness of national and international governance compared to private finance and international finance. And the key sort of thing that we always return to is that it's only people that are alive today and people with high incomes that can actually affect economic markets. People that don't have much money, much income, or the people who haven't been born yet have no capacity to affect how we use the environment, affect how we make a profit. So basically we're seeing that private wealth is subsidised at public cost. Okay, so, I mean, lots of subsidies that seem on the surface to be great, actually are massively underestimating the value that's lost to the public good by subsidising the creation of wealth for the private individual and their family. So if the World Bank loans money to a farmer or a shrimp farmer in Thailand, you might be able to generate $1,000 or $2,000 a month or a year per hectare for the shrimp farmer, but the loss of the services that are felt much more remotely by fishermen further away is lost forever. So you're privatising wealth at the cost of the public good. The public benefits are always underestimated because of this aspect of market failure and the costs that are avoided are hard to quantify. The benefit of mangroves in preventing storms and disasters and things like that. This is a really interesting plot, which I really have more time to go into, but really it's about understanding the way that you can achieve a huge amount of development. All of this kind of development that's going on. This is the Human Development Index across the x-axis here. Y is the ecological footprint, and this is the average biocapacity that's available per person, ignoring the needs of world species. And you can see that actually a lot of progress along the Human Development Index, access to clean water, female education can happen without a big increase in consumption. But the consumption that spikes at the end actually does very, very little to increase the huge amount of consumption that happens for a very small increase in development index towards the end. So we move into an area of consumption where we're borrowing money that we can't afford to buy things we don't need, to impress people that we don't care about. So there's this whole kind of idea that you have a lot of movement along this axis. Look at China and India. As soon as you get to these areas of what we call the developed world, you're seeing huge amounts of consumption aren't actually improving development at all. And that's the real tragedy of it. We're exploiting the environment, destroying the environment for very little gain for most people. We're all developing countries in this sense. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these statistics that the richest 10% of the world produce the same amount of carbon as the poorest 50%. If you're earning more than $8 a day, then you're in the richest 50% of the world. And well, this is good in one way because it's telling us that the decisions that we make as individuals can have a massive effect. They can have a massive effect on how the economy works. We are actually in a privileged position to be able to change how the economy works. And this is something that really, I think, is a really important leap for ecology and for biodiversity, is that we're really starting to understand that biodiversity loss is a cause of social injustice. It's a symptom of social injustice and it's a cause of it as well. The world's poor and their descendants are suffering most from biodiversity loss. They tend to depend on biodiversity most particularly, most locally, and they're least responsible for its loss, and they have the least financial and political power to change the systems that are causing that loss. But not only intergenerational poverty, but also intergenerational poverty. This is actually children in Bordeaux, when I was in Bordeaux, who were lying down in the street to protest their playground being bulldozed. They had very little capacity to change. They were allowed to protest for 5 minutes, then they were moved, and the playground was bulldozed. So people with very little power to affect the things that's happening to them. GDP of the poor is not valued. The GDP, the benefits we get from ecosystems are not recorded as part of GDP. A tree is worth much more dead than alive. So we have to transform all kinds of things very, very quickly. We have to transform how we consume, particularly how we consume our food. So current food systems in particular have a huge effect on the largest cause of global environmental change. They're responsible for about a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions. 86% of species are at risk of extinction because of our food systems, and they contribute to huge amounts of tropical deforestation. So this graph on the left shows you how many planets we would need if all of the world behaved the way that we consume, just in terms of our food economies. The subsidies that go into fueling this type of economy that's hugely destructive are enormous, and this is all paid for. At least these ones in the public ones in grey, $1.7 trillion a year goes into public subsidy to fund nature-destructive activities, things that destroy nature. And this is private finance that's subsidising these activities. So we really have to transform our food system first of all and think about how expensive it is to have animal proteins, think about how we consume, has a massive effect. And as I say, we are the wealthy people. How we consume makes a big difference to how economies work. Luckily for us, we are privileged in that way. Some quite scary statistics, I'm sure many of you have seen this, of how much of the mammalian biomass on the planet comes from wild organisms. Look at the proportion that's cattle. This is humans here, and this is cattle. Domesticated 630 megatons to 20 megatons of wild. That's all the wild vertebrates you can think of. I once had an argument with somebody about numbers of chickens. There are 27 billion chickens alive on the earth at any one time, any given day. The biomass of chickens is 3 times that of wild living birds. And this guy was going to me, there's no way, where are my chickens? Like, there's 7 billion, that's 4 chickens per person. And I said to him, well, it takes 6 weeks for a chicken to grow. So how many chickens do you eat in 6 weeks? Well, at least 4. Okay, so he worked, he actually ate maybe 10 chickens every 6 weeks. So he was one of the big, he was like a typical UK consumer. But yeah, we really have to transform how we consume food. This is the amount of land area that would be needed to supply the UK with enough protein for different sources of protein. You can see that beef and lamb are massively require a huge area to supply the UK's protein needs. Whichever way you look at it, Birmingham has got a lot of work to do in these slides. So what are the kind of, I think I should probably stop speaking, but I've got just a couple more slides if that's okay. But how are we going to learn? How are we going to learn from what hope is there that we can achieve these transformations? Well, I would say one source of hope is that we were able to achieve incredible transformations to society when we needed to. This is something that Georgina Mace always used to say. When societies need to change things, when they recognise the urgency of a situation, they can change things. And think about what happens during wartime, the mobilisation of economies, the US economy during the Second World War, the development of technology to murder people, how fast that advanced between 1939 and 1945. We have to think about applying that kind of technology now to addressing these issues here. Think about what was achieved during COVID, how much the whole economy changed during COVID. When they realised how urgent the problem was, how many people were going to die if we did nothing. If we can apply that same urgency to these other waiting emergencies, we would actually be able to achieve something really quite incredible. But all of this depends on people listening to scientists and stable governments who actually believe scientists and actually they believe that there's things that have to be changed. Transformation requires this kind of stability. We have to really challenge this spectre of populism. I was thinking about writing this talk before Trump was elected would have been a lot easier than writing it after Trump has been elected. But I think this is one of the things that highlights the importance of universities and institutions, that we have to constantly challenge this populism that's rife. And I'll talk about that in a second, about why it's so rife. We have to really tell people why we think we know what we know, not just what we know, but bring them into the narratives of science and how we understand the world. And remember that those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities, and always be defending rational, science-driven politics. Because we really are seeing a resurgence of populism, and I would see this as actually, in a way, a response to the very earnest attempts of us to sort of transform the economy after the global economic crash of 2008, as well as after the COVID. We were also asking questions, how do we need to grow back better and change things and change the way the economy works? Well, I see the way that populism has resurged as being very, very vested interest trying to prevent that from happening. And I am haunted by this idea that as society have to break before we can transform it and rebuild it, just like it did after the Second World War. Because the kind of changes that we're talking about require sustained effort, stability, and funding. And this kind of idea of where does populism come from, I think it's really ironic. It seems increasingly clear that what's happening is populism is emerging because of the precariat who aren't served by capitalism, at least not anymore. And they're being taxed for their incomes. Governments are taxing incomes, not wealth. These people don't have social mobility. And these are the people who are voting for these answers that seem very simple, very clear, but actually are leading them into a completely wrong way of living and a wrong solution. They say they want system change, not regime change. Well, that's exactly what I say as well. I say I want system change, not regime change. And they're saying the same thing, but from a completely other direction. And that's because we're taxing these people, and we're putting these people against each other rather than the people who are really making money from wealth. We're not taxing wealth very effectively. We need to be. Okay, so just my last sort of couple of slides. The big challenge is, how do we stay optimistic in 2024 given this thing? Well, I think we have got an increased awareness of the necessity for biodiversity for development and the cost of overconsumption, and also how it's not really making us that happy. It's not improving our health that much, this overconsumption that we're doing. And I think that's a change to what it was like 30 years ago. We are really seeing that biodiversity is critical for development. Things are changing, especially from the bottom up, through pure necessity, like the risk of planting forests now, coffee plantation or planting forests or agriculture, the insurance risks are much higher than they were before. So financial systems are actually taking into account ecological risk. We are much better at connecting and getting information when we need it. If we are prepared to see information that's uncomfortable, we can change the world. A lot of stuff didn't happen at the last COPs. A lot of stuff did happen. And I was talking to somebody who said that 10 years ago, we could not even imagine these kind of agreements. Just the agreements in principle are a huge step forward. They're not enough, but they're a huge step forward. It is possible to have huge societal transformations when things are really urgent. Let's hope that things don't become urgent so fast that it's too late. Also, the thing I constantly return to is populism doesn't work. Okay, it doesn't provide solutions to the real problems that we face. Only science and rationality can produce solutions that will actually allow us to live on this planet as if we intend to stay here. And in a way as well, the fact that we're getting such resistance from these people, from the world's wealthy, tells us that we are actually attacking a system. What do we expect if we attack a system that works so well for the powerful? And I think it's really important to think about just this positive view that Georgina Mace was so good at promoting, this idea that the world could be much, much better. If we follow this path, we're really facing this bifurcation. We follow this path of more conservation, of less consumption, more equitable society. We end up in a fantastic place, better than it is now. The other route takes us into a really, really dark place. So it's all about regaining our place in nature, choosing a nature-positive future, and not selling sort of nightmares, but selling dreams, selling the idea the world will be much better with more biodiversity, much more resilient, much more stable, much more just. We need to start living on this planet as if we mean to stay here. And we need to think about future generations in particular. What really haunts me is what kind of ancestors we are. Because we do not think about future generations, they will never forget us. And I'll stop there because I know I've run a little bit over time and just put up my summary slide and say thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, John, for an absolutely fantastic talk. I'm Professor Kate Jones. I'm the director of the People and Nature Lab that John has talked about. And Gail asked me to host a question and answer session. So if you have any questions for John, I think he'd be very, very happy to take them. So I'll give you a few moments. I'll tell you a bit about my work.
I told you the fourth part was an overestimate. I should have just stuck with like the problem. You could work out the problem for yourself, how we live on a new world.
So I'm actually a sixth cousin 8 times removed from Charles Darwin. Quite funny. But also I work on understanding the links between biodiversity loss and zoonotic disease emergence like COVID and Ebola, Lassa fever in West Africa, that kind of thing. And I also work on that kind of interface of new tech, so thinking about how can we use AI and new sensors to monitor the biodiversity on our planet better, and so we can make better decisions about how we manage these. So, okay, I've given you a few minutes now, so you should be able to yes, in the middle there with the red. Has someone got a microphone? Just project. Thank you so much.
Well, that's actually really important. We have a lot of discussions about this in CBER. People ask us, students ask us all the time, what kind of protest do you advocate? What's the best way to change things? I think it's very much a personal view about where you feel like you want to make a difference. I think I keep returning to the fact that we have a lot of power as very wealthy people in the world, and how we choose to spend our money makes a huge difference. I know that's in a way, it's kind of vacuous, morally vacuous point of view, because you sort of say, well, consumer-led change, and that, much of that money is kind of coming from exploitation of the environment. But I do think that choosing how you bank, where you put your pension funds, how you consume makes a huge difference. I think having conversations with friends and family, I think definitely like bringing people in, not making people feel like they're ignorant, not shaming people through the fact that things they haven't made connections or through their views. It's actually about really listening to people, bringing them into the narratives that we have, trying to explain what's really a very complicated idea, much of it, but it's very beautiful. The idea there is beauty in this uncertainty and this complexity. And I think also, arguing for system change, I don't know if that's answered your question. Has it answered your question? I'm not somebody, I do speak a lot. I try and engage constantly with people about these issues, but I don't go and protest in the streets. But I'm very sympathetic to people who do. We had a whole session about the consequences or the role of scientists in protesting. Yeah.
I don't think it doesn't make a difference, though. I think that you have to change minds, and by marching, you did change some minds. They realise it was a problem. It is a problem. And they make that next decision, they can make a better one. But if you weren't there, then it would make it. That wouldn't. It's important that you were there. No, you don't think it was making a difference.
Yeah, I think it's really about changing the minds of the people you're close to, people that are in your social circle. It's like the same way we challenge any kind of thinking that we don't agree with. The way that we've changed things in the past. People's views on sexuality, for example, have been changed by constantly sort of expanding expanding the ideas of what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable. I think engaging with your friends is really important. Don't be bullied into silence when people say things you don't agree with. Constantly, I think defending institutions is really important, particularly things like universities, which I would say, but also things, the idea of rationality, the idea that things aren't true because you like them to be true.
Can I take some more?
Yes, please do.
Okay, so maybe I'll take 3 in a row. Can you cope with that?
I'll try.
Okay, right, one at the back. Project, please. Okay, BNG.
Yeah.
One over here, yes. Fantastic. BNG, siloisation, yes. Fantastic questions.
they're great
Can you
questions.
remember?
So the net gain is a real. I mean, it was who was asking about net gain? Yeah, it's a fantastic. I mean, that is a fantastic thing that was committed to at the COP 15. But you're right; it's fraught with problems because it's very easy to say, well, let's protect a bit of biodiversity here in the uplands of northern England. I mean, there's lots of, in places where we've already lost a lot of biodiversity, it's very easy to just protect certain areas to sort of say, oh, there's net gain here. Well, actually, what we need is the 30 by 30 rule, right? About 30% of nature protected by 2030. But it just says that each national country has to make its own idea about which 30% it protects. And of course, it's going to go for the easiest, least profitable areas to protect. And they're often not the places where most of the biodiversity is. So you're right. I mean, it's a great resolution that's been passed. Whether or not it actually the one in England, yeah, okay. The biodiversity net gain in England, yeah. Well, I think provided it's I would say in an ideal world, the 30 by 30 would be an international thing, and most of that 30% would be in the tropics, where most of the biodiversity actually is. I don't know much about the actual national level of that level of policy. Probably Kate knows more about it.
We can pick it up later.
Yeah.
Siloisation.
Siloisation, yes, you're totally right. Most of my work, when I'm not trying to do things in rainforests in Australia, is trying to convince people that we have to consider biodiversity, the ecological emergency, alongside the climate emergency. They're not nested within each other. They have to be considered separately, but they have to be considered the way they connect. And they connect in very complex ways. And I'm concerned if that's the case, that was the case at COP29. I think, well, maybe we can talk later about your experiences at COP29. We had people at COP16 and COP29. I haven't really digested what happened there.
And policymakers, how do we engage them?
Well, we engage with them through going to a lot of parliamentary committees that we go to within CBER. We engage, particularly most recently, we were the only university, actually, UCL was the only university that, when talked to a parliamentary select committee about food security and its effects on biodiversity, not its effects on climate, which goes back to your point there. We're thinking about understanding how we can change UK food security in order to maximise or minimise the effects on biodiversity loss in other places in the world. As you saw, we're not self-sufficient in terms of our food security. We have to import food, and that has major consequences. So we give guidance to government about the types of food policy, food security they should be pursuing, and the consequences for biodiversity loss and for carbon for net zero. And often those two things aren't exactly aligned. But basically, we do lots and lots of different things. You can probably say something about that. Okay. I know it's not your talk. Yeah.
Okay, I'll take 2 more questions if they're quick. Yes, one there and then one there. And there was a coral reefs, then world food system.
I hope that we're wrong about coral reefs. I hope I got across to you how much I love coral reefs and the way that they affect people. I don't know we're hoping that coral reefs some of them might be able to evolve. There's been periods in the past when coral reefs have gone and they've reappeared. We are probably entering a period where coral reef building is going to be almost ending. There will still be some somewhere, I suspect, but we won't, certainly the livelihoods that depend on coral reefs, much of the biodiversity that's there will be gone, unfortunately. I've had personal encounters with people who've run dive centres for like for 3 generations, who are like, so I can't live, there's nothing here anymore. And I've actually heard stories about people who are supervised by coral reef biologists, and the supervisor say, "Oh, go to this place, there'll be amazing reef there. I was there 10 years ago." And the students come back and they won't tell the supervisor, who's like about to retire, they're not there anymore. They say, "Oh, we went there, it was really nice." So the anxiety and the depression that coral reef biologists, imagine being an art historian. Basically what you're doing is watching art galleries burning down at every moment, every day, being a coral reef biologist. Food systems. Yes, I don't think there's any reason to stop me eating meat entirely, unless there's lots of moral reasons why one might want to do that. But from an ecological point of view, definitely reducing the amount of meat that you eat would be very, very beneficial to the environment. But the one thing you can do that makes a huge difference is reducing your consumption of beef. Or I would say consume meat in a conscious way and consume meat that's expensive. It should be really expensive. You think about what, certainly my grandparents, the way they treated meat was with a certain amount of real, sort of like it was treated with as a celebration to have meat. We used to have, they would have meat once or twice a week. So, I think a lot of the food cuisine that we really love, a lot of that we celebrate comes out of making a lot of very small amounts of meat. And I think often you think about Italian food in the United States, it's often ruined by the fact there's so much animal fat in it. You think actually much better to cook in the way they do in Sicily and southern Italy, where they use very, very small amounts. So absolutely, the way that you consume is probably the biggest thing you can change, and the way that you consume food in particular make a massive difference. Yeah.
Well, I think you'll agree. I hope that we've had a fantastic session. But before we say thank you to John, on behalf of the Faculty of Life Sciences, I would like to thank our alumni who continue to commit funds to our scholarship fund, which enables our undergraduates to participate in summer scholarships and experience some real research, such as that you've been hearing about this evening, during a 6-week project. So we really value those funds, so thank you very much. Now, secondly, we'd like to invite you to join us in the Grant Museum. We have an amazing virtual reality coral reef exhibit that we'd like to share, and also perhaps a drink and some more conversation, which would be wonderful. You may have noticed that your badges are a little bit of our contribution to biodiversity. They're actually impregnated with seeds. So please take them home and plant them, and best of luck with that. But please, as you join us going over to the Grant Museum, please join me in thanking John for an absolutely outstanding lecture.